My phone vibrated against the cool marble counter of the green room. I looked down at the glowing screen. The group chat, ironically named Family First, was lighting up. I had just sent a simple message asking if anyone was close to the venue. My father, Richard, replied almost immediately. "Just a teacher, Emily. What is there to celebrate? We are taking Rachel to Mortons Steakhouse for closing a condo." A second later, my sister Rachel chimed in. "We have other plans tonight. Enjoy your little school thing." The read receipt from my mother Susan appeared quietly at the bottom of the screen. She saw the messages. She saw the cruelty. She said absolutely nothing. I picked up the phone and typed two simple words. "It is okay." I hit send and dropped the device back onto the counter. I did not cry. I did not throw anything across the room. I simply turned to the full-length vanity mirror and adjusted the lapel of my tailored navy suit. Outside the heavy oak door of my private dressing room, I could hear the muffled roar of thousands of people and the rapid-fire clicking of press cameras. My name is Emily. I am 35 years old. Have you ever realized that the people who share your blood are the ones actively praying for your downfall? Stick around because tonight I made them watch me rise from the ashes they left me in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to lock your toxic family out of your success. Looking at my reflection, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The suit I wore cost more than my first car. It was a far cry from the oversized clearance rack sweaters I used to wear when I taught special education in a neglected public school. Richard had always made sure I knew my exact place in the family hierarchy. He was a man utterly obsessed with status, wealth, and appearances. To him, my chosen profession was financial suicide. He often called teaching a charity case career at family dinners, ensuring everyone at the table could share a loud laugh at my expense. Rachel, on the other hand, was his golden child. She was a real estate agent who spent significantly more time curating her social media presence than actually showing properties. Closing a single mid-range condo after 6 months of absolutely zero sales was apparently grounds for a massive celebration at an expensive downtown steakhouse. Morton's was Richard's favorite place to show off. He loved ordering the most expensive wine on the menu just to make the waiter announce the price out loud to the surrounding tables. I could perfectly picture them sitting there right now, laughing at my expense, toasting to Rachel's absolute mediocrity, while actively ignoring the biggest night of my entire life. I knew Jamal, my brother-in-law, was likely sitting at that steakhouse table in absolute silence. Jamal was a brilliant corporate auditor, and the only person in that family who ever treated me with an ounce of genuine respect. I knew he had wanted to come to my ceremony tonight, but Rachel had undoubtedly thrown a massive tantrum to ensure he attended her supposed victory dinner instead. Jamal was a man of numbers, and lately I knew he was growing extremely tired of the numbers in his own marriage not adding up. But tonight was not about Jamal. Tonight was about the empire I had built entirely in the dark. When my father called me a glorified babysitter years ago, he completely failed to understand what I was actually doing in that basement classroom. I was not just teaching. I was observing. I was coding. I had spent countless sleepless nights developing an interactive communication software platform specifically designed for nonverbal children on the autism spectrum. What started as a small program on a single tablet in my classroom had slowly caught the attention of regional school districts, then state boards, then national educational associations. My father never bothered to ask why I was working 80-hour weeks. He only saw the modest public school salary on my tax returns and wrote me off entirely. The green room was dead silent save for the low hum of the mini-fridge. A spread of expensive catered food sat untouched on a glass table. I had not eaten a single bite. My stomach was tied in tight knots, not from nerves but from the sheer adrenaline of the impending reveal. The makeup artist had left 10 minutes ago, leaving me completely alone with my thoughts and the bitter reality of my family's absence. The heavy oak door suddenly clicked open. My executive assistant Maria stepped inside holding a thick leather binder. She looked at me with a tight professional smile, but I could clearly see the nervous excitement dancing in her eyes. 5 minutes until you are on, Emily, she said, her voice slightly breathless. The auditorium is completely packed. The governor just took his seat in the front row, and the tech investors from Silicon Valley are all gathered near the press pit. I nodded, taking a deep, slow breath to steady my racing heart. Did the final wire transfer clear? I asked her. Maria opened the binder and handed me a stamped confirmation slip. Yes, the final $50,000 on your initial startup loan has been paid in full as of exactly 10 minutes ago. The legal paperwork is completely finalized. You officially own 100% of the intellectual property. I stared at the bank confirmation slip, tracing the printed numbers with my thumb. 5 years ago, I had stood in Richard's immaculate home office, practically begging him to co-sign a small business loan to help me launch my educational technology platform. I had the coding background, and I had the curriculum. I just needed the initial seed money to get the private servers running. He had laughed directly in my face. He told me that investing in a teacher was akin to setting his money on fire. He told me to stick to grading spelling tests and leave the real business to the adults in the room. The very next day, he co-signed a $2 million loan for Rachel's luxury real estate agency. An agency that I knew for an absolute fact was currently drowning in massive hidden debt and facing severe audit inquiries. I handed the confirmation slip back to Maria. Good. I told her, my voice steady and ice cold. Let us make sure my slate is completely clean before I touch that microphone. I smoothed down my jacket one last time, feeling the invisible armor I had meticulously built for myself over the past 5 agonizing years. I could hear the announcer over the public address system beginning the introductory remarks. The massive crowd outside fell completely silent. My family honestly thought I was sitting in a high school gymnasium somewhere tonight, waiting to be handed a cheap plastic trophy and a $20 gift card to a local coffee shop. They thought they were putting me in my place by abandoning me. They had absolutely no idea the sheer magnitude of the earthquake that was about to hit them. I was not walking out there to receive a simple teaching award. I was stepping onto that illuminated stage to be crowned the National Innovator of the Year. And much more importantly, my software platform had just officially secured a $40 million federal endowment. As the announcer called my name, the crowd erupted into a deafening roar that shook the walls of the green room. I walked out into the blinding lights, leaving my phone sitting face down on the marble counter. Let them eat their steak. Let them drink their expensive wine. By the time my father asked for the check, the entire world was going to know exactly who I was. The blinding lights of the auditorium hit me like a physical force. The sheer volume of the applause was deafening, a physical vibration that rattled through the floorboards and up through the soles of my heels. I walked across the massive stage, projecting a calm confidence I had spent years perfecting. In the front row, tech billionaires and venture capitalists stood on their feet applauding. Men and women who ran global empires were looking up at me with genuine respect. Waiting for me at the center podium was the Secretary of Education standing beside the governor. They were smiling warmly, gesturing for me to take my place. The secretary handed me a heavy glass trophy. It caught the stage lights, scattering prisms across the dark room. I looked down at the engraved silver plate. National Innovator of the Year. It was a title that felt heavy and profound, entirely erasing the glorified babysitter label my father had tried to brand me with. I stepped up to the microphone, the room slowly quieted down, settling into a hushed anticipation. I did not give a long rambling speech about my childhood or the people who had doubted me. I kept my eyes focused on the sea of industry leaders and journalists. I spoke about the children who had been left behind by a rigid system. I spoke about the nonverbal autistic students who had brilliant minds trapped behind a wall of silence. I told the audience how my software bridged that gap, giving a voice to those who had been forgotten. And then I dropped the announcement that would send shockwaves through the educational technology sector. I officially confirmed that our platform had just secured a $40 million federal endowment to integrate our software into public school districts nationwide. The room erupted again. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing the exact moment my life permanently shifted from a struggling startup founder to an industry titan. I owned every single line of code, every patent, and every share of the company. I had built a fortress, and I held the only key. While I was shaking hands with the governor and posing for the press, my family was sitting exactly 3 miles away in a curved leather booth at Mortons Steakhouse. Jamal would later recount the entire agonizing dinner to me with surgical precision. It was a masterclass in delusion. My father Richard was in his absolute element. He had insisted on a booth near the center of the dining room where he could be seen and heard by as many patrons as possible. He ordered a vintage Cabernet that cost more than my first month of rent out of college. He made sure the sommelier presented the label to the table with a flourish, loudly confirming the absurd price tag before allowing it to be poured. Across the table, my sister Rachel sat basking in the artificial glow of our parents' conditional love. She had spent the first 20 minutes of the dinner loudly bragging about her latest real estate triumph. In reality, she had barely managed to close on a mid-range 2-bedroom condo after 6 months of complete professional stagnation. But in the twisted reality of my family, this single mediocre transaction was treated like the corporate merger of the century. My mother Susan smiled warmly at Rachel, raising her wine glass in a toast. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, sweetheart," Susan said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness she reserved only for her golden child. "You have always had such an incredible head for business. You take after your father completely." Jamal sat at the end of the booth, staring at his untouched steak. As a senior corporate auditor, Jamal made his living by finding the missing numbers, the hidden liabilities, and the uncomfortable truths that people tried to bury. He had spent the last 3 weeks quietly reviewing his own household finances after noticing strange discrepancies in his and Rachel's joint accounts. He knew for an absolute fact that Rachel was not a successful real estate agent. Her agency was bleeding money, and she had been secretly siphoning funds to keep up the lavish lifestyle she constantly paraded in front of Richard and Susan. Jamal knew Rachel had forced this dinner to happen tonight specifically to overshadow my award ceremony. She could not stand the thought of anyone else in the family receiving even a fraction of the spotlight. Jamal had wanted to attend my event. He had always respected my quiet dedication, and he knew how hard I worked in my classroom. But Rachel had thrown a screaming fit that morning, accusing him of not supporting her career. To keep the peace in his crumbling marriage, he had put on a suit and followed them to the steakhouse. As the waiter cleared the dinner plates and brought out the dessert menus, Richard leaned back against the plush leather booth. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and pulled his phone from his inner pocket. "Let us see what the markets are doing," he muttered casually, swiping his thumb across the screen. Jamal watched my father open a prominent financial news application. Richard was a man who obsessed over wealth, so his algorithms were constantly feeding him live updates from the business world. At that exact moment, the top trending live stream on the front page was the National Innovator of the Year Gala. Jamal noticed the exact second my father's entire reality shattered. Richard's thumb suddenly stopped moving. He froze completely, perfectly still like a statue. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the dim restaurant lighting. He blinked rapidly, bringing the phone closer to his face, as if his eyes were actively betraying him. "What is it, Richard?" my mother asked, pausing with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. "You look like you just saw a ghost." "Wait," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Wait, what is that?" Rachel rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Dad put the phone away. We are celebrating my closing, remember?" But Richard did not put the phone away. He slowly placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth directly in the center of the booth. The video was playing on silent, but the high-definition screen was crystal clear. It showed me standing at a podium bathed in bright lights, holding a massive glass trophy. Next to me was the governor of our state. The scrolling headline beneath the video was written in bold, undeniable text. Former public school teacher, Emily secures $40 million federal endowment for revolutionary edtech platform. Susan dropped her coffee cup. It hit the saucer with a sharp clatter, spilling hot liquid over the white linen. She stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing defensively. She immediately tried to downplay what she was seeing, resorting to her usual tactic of belittling me. "Oh, please," Rachel sneered, crossing her arms. "It is probably just some small local grant for school supplies. You know how public schools are always begging for pencil money. They are just making a big deal out of nothing." Jamal had finally heard enough. The years of watching them treat me like dirt, the months of uncovering Rachel's financial lies, and the sheer audacity of sitting in an expensive steakhouse while ignoring a massive milestone all boiled over. Jamal calmly reached across the table and picked up his own phone. He opened the exact same news article and read the text aloud, slicing through Rachel's desperate delusion like a scalpel. "No, Rachel," Jamal said, his voice low and incredibly sharp. "I do not think this is for pencil money." The article states that Emily owns the intellectual property entirely. She did not just win a grant for a school. She is the sole founder and CEO of a multi-million-dollar enterprise as of tonight. The booth fell completely dead silent. The only sound was the clinking of silverware from the surrounding tables and the soft jazz playing over the restaurant speakers. Jamal looked directly at Richard, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He let the reality of the situation sink in before delivering the final blow. "Your younger daughter just secured $40 million in federal backing. She is rubbing shoulders with billionaires and governors. And you guys skipped her coronation to celebrate a $3,000 commission check." Richard stared at the phone. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The daughter he had mocked, the daughter he had refused to help, the daughter he called a glorified babysitter was now exponentially wealthier and more powerful than he could ever hope to be. Panic set in. Pure, unadulterated panic. He realized instantly that the family scapegoat was now the one holding all the cards, and he had spent the last 3 hours proving exactly how little she meant to him. The silence at the steakhouse table was absolute. Richard stared at the digital article on Jamal's phone as if it were a ticking bomb. The panic in his chest was visible. He began to sweat right through his expensive tailored shirt. He realized the daughter he had spent 35 years treating like garbage was now sitting on a $40 million empire. "Check!" Richard barked suddenly. He practically knocked over his crystal water glass, waving his hand frantically at the waiter. "We need the check right now. Cancel the dessert." Rachel slammed her hands down on the table. "Are you kidding me, Dad?" she whined, her voice pitching up into a shrill register. "This is my dinner. I closed a condo today. We are supposed to be celebrating my success." Richard did not even look at her. He threw $300 bills onto the white linen tablecloth, not even waiting for the leather folio. "Your sister is downtown with the governor, Rachel. Do you have any idea what kind of capital $40 million is? We have to go support her. We are her family." Susan nodded rapidly, immediately shifting her allegiance the way she always did when money was involved. "Your father is right, Rachel. We should be there. Emily is probably wondering where we are." Jamal watched the entire pathetic display with quiet disgust. Less than an hour ago, they were laughing at my expense. Now they were tripping over themselves to get a piece of the pie. Jamal stood up and tossed his napkin onto his untouched steak. "I will drive," Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. The car ride to the downtown gala was painfully tense. Jamal would later tell me it was the quietest Richard and Susan had ever been. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, furiously scrolling through her phone, trying to find any loophole or correction to the article. She desperately wanted it to be a mistake. She muttered under her breath that I must have tricked the investors, or that the money was just a restricted government grant that I could not actually touch. Jamal kept his eyes on the road. "Keep reading, Rachel," he said calmly. "Read the part about the intellectual property again. It says she owns it outright. There is no loophole. Your sister outplayed all of you. They pulled up to the grand entrance of the downtown hotel. The street was lined with black luxury vehicles and news vans. The sheer scale of the event made Rachel's little condo celebration look like a child's lemonade stand. Richard practically shoved his way out of the car before Jamal even put it in park. He adjusted his tie and put on his best corporate smile, ready to swoop in and claim his position as the proud patriarch. They walked up the red carpet leading to the VIP entrance. Two massive security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces stood blocking the double glass doors. A thick velvet rope separated the elite guests from the general public. Richard marched right up to the rope, expecting it to be unhooked immediately. "Good evening," Richard said, using his most authoritative voice. "We are the family of the guest of honor. I am Emily's father." The security guard did not flinch. He pulled a digital tablet from his jacket and scrolled down the screen. "I need to see your invitations, sir, or I need your names to check against the approved guest list." Richard let out a condescending chuckle. "I just told you who I am. I am her father. This is her mother and her sister. We do not need an invitation. Go tell Emily that Richard is here." The guard looked up from the tablet, his expression completely blank. "I am sorry, sir. Your names are not on the approved family list. The only family member currently approved for entry is a Mr. Jamal." Richard turned bright red. The veins in his neck bulged. Rachel scoffed loudly, throwing her hands up in the air. "This is ridiculous," Rachel snapped. "She is just trying to embarrass us. Tell her to come out here right now." "I am not a messenger, ma'am," the guard replied, stepping slightly forward to physically block their path. "Step away from the entrance, or I will have you escorted off the property." Inside the lobby, I had just finished taking my final press photos with my board of directors. The flash photography was blinding, but I felt completely grounded. I was holding a glass of sparkling water when I heard a familiar commotion echoing through the thick glass of the front entrance. I recognized my father's booming, arrogant voice immediately. I turned and walked slowly toward the lobby doors. My executive assistant, Maria, fell into step beside me, looking concerned. "Do you want me to call the police?" Maria asked quietly, noticing the aggressive posture of the man shouting at our security team. "No, Maria," I said calmly, keeping my eyes locked on the glass doors. "That is just my family. Let me handle this." I pushed open the inner doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The lingering press photographers immediately turned their cameras toward me, sensing fresh drama. I stood behind the velvet rope looking at the four people standing on the sidewalk. Richard saw me and immediately plastered a massive fake smile across his face. "Emily, sweetheart," he shouted, reaching his arms over the velvet rope as if he wanted to hug me. "Tell these idiots who I am. They are trying to keep your own father out of your celebration." Susan stepped up right beside him, clutching her designer purse. "We are so proud of you, honey." We rushed over as soon as we heard the news. I did not smile back. I did not step closer. I looked at the three of them standing there, completely desperate for a piece of the spotlight they had tried so hard to deny me. Then I looked at Jamal, who was standing a few feet behind them, holding his car keys. Jamal gave me a single subtle nod of respect. I turned my attention back to my father. I spoke loudly and clearly, making absolute sure that the press reporters standing 10 feet away caught every single word. "You are not coming inside, Richard," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls of the hotel entrance. Richard's fake smile dropped instantly. "What are you talking about, Emily? I am your father. I funded your education. I supported you." I tilted my head, looking at him with nothing but pity. 3 hours ago, I texted you asking if you were coming to my ceremony. You told me I was just a teacher, and that investing in me was burning money. You chose to celebrate Rachel's condo instead. So please go back to the steakhouse. You are not affiliated with my foundation, and you certainly are not invited to my party. Jamal would later recount the exact sequence of events at the steakhouse table to me with the precision of a trained auditor. As I was stepping up to the podium bathed in the glow of camera flashes, my family was completely oblivious sitting in their curved leather booth at Morton's. Richard had just finished a heavy bite of his medium-rare ribeye when his routine habit of checking the financial markets took over. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit jacket pocket. The screen illuminated his face, casting a pale bluish glow over his features. He tapped open his personalized news feed, expecting to see late-evening updates on stock futures or commercial real estate trends. Instead, the algorithm delivered something that would completely shatter his carefully constructed reality. Richard stopped chewing. His jaw literally froze mid-bite. The ambient noise of the busy restaurant, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the low hum of wealthy patrons discussing business deals seemed to vanish entirely from his awareness. He swallowed hard, his eyes locked onto a trending live stream, prominently featured at the very top of his primary news application. The thumbnail alone was enough to make his blood run cold. It was a high-definition image of me. Rachel was in the middle of a long-winded complaint about the escrow process for her condo. She was gesturing wildly with a silver fork, completely oblivious to the seismic shift happening on her father's phone. She was complaining about how the buyer's agent had tried to negotiate the closing costs, acting as if she had just brokered a multinational corporate merger instead of selling a mediocre two-bedroom apartment. Susan was the first to notice the sudden change in her husband. "Richard," she said, her voice sharp with sudden concern, cutting through Rachel's rambling story, "you look like you just swallowed a stone. What is wrong with you?" Richard did not answer immediately. He slowly lowered his fork to his plate. His hand was trembling so severely that the silver utensil clattered loudly against the fine china. "Wait," he muttered, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "Wait, what is that?" He tapped the screen with a shaking thumb to unmute the video. Suddenly, the clear, authoritative voice of the state governor echoed from the tiny speakers of Richard's phone. The volume was loud enough to make the couple at the adjacent table turn their heads. The governor was speaking passionately about the future of education, about breaking barriers, and about visionary leadership that would change the trajectory of public schooling forever. Then the camera panned to show me standing tall, confident, and radiant in my tailored navy suit. I was holding the massive crystal National Innovator of the Year trophy, smiling out at a crowd of industry titans. Susan leaned across the table, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the white tablecloth. She squinted at the bright screen. "Is that Emily?" she asked, her tone shifting rapidly from concern to utter confusion. "What is she doing there? Why is she standing on a stage with the governor?" Susan dropped her own fork, leaving a smear of peppercorn sauce on the pristine linen. Rachel stopped her monologue abruptly. She glared at the phone screen, a flash of deep-seated jealousy instantly igniting behind her eyes. She hated anything that pulled attention away from her, especially on a night dedicated to her supposed success. She let out a loud, dismissive scoff, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "Oh, please," Rachel sneered, rolling her eyes. "Turn that off, Dad. It is probably just some charity dinner for public school teachers. You know how they are always begging for grants to buy pencils and art supplies. They probably just picked a random local teacher to stand on stage for a photo opportunity to make the politicians look good." But Richard could not turn it off. His eyes were glued to the scrolling text beneath the live video feed. It was not a local public access broadcast. It was a direct stream from Forbes. The bold headline flashed across the bottom of the screen in bright, undeniable letters. "Former public school teacher Emily secures $40 million federal endowment for revolutionary edtech platform." Underneath that, the sub-headline delivered an even heavier blow to Richard's massive ego. "Sole founder retains 100% ownership of intellectual property." Richard was a man who worshipped money and corporate power. He understood the exact weight of the words federal endowment and intellectual property. He knew instantly that this was not a grant for classroom supplies. This was total corporate dominance. The daughter he had mocked, the daughter he had refused to lend a single dime to, the daughter he had called a terrible investment, was currently standing on a stage accepting control of $40 million. He did the rapid math in his head. My net worth had just surpassed his entire lifetime of earnings in a single evening. Jamal sat quietly at the end of the booth, observing the entire scene unfold. As a corporate auditor, he was highly trained to look for discrepancies and to read the unspoken truth in any room. He looked at Richard's pale, sweating face. He looked at Susan's open-mouthed shock. And then he looked at his wife Rachel, who was desperately trying to gaslight the table into believing that my massive triumph was nothing more than a pathetic charity handout. Jamal felt a deep, sickening knot form in his stomach. He realized how deeply toxic Rachel's delusion truly was. Rachel was willing to deny reality itself rather than admit her sister had achieved something extraordinary. Jamal knew Rachel's condo sale was a desperate attempt to cover up her failing agency. He had seen the credit card statements she tried to hide. He had seen the second mortgage documents she had secretly drafted. He sat there watching her tear me down while knowing she was personally drowning in massive hidden debt. It made her sneering comment about begging for pencils incredibly hypocritical and pathetic. Richard reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed his wine glass, taking a massive gulp of the expensive Cabernet. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how he had completely missed this. How had Emily built an empire right under his nose? He remembered the time I had asked him to review my initial business plan 5 years ago. He had barely glanced at the executive summary before tossing it back across his heavy mahogany desk, telling me to stop playing pretend. Now the exact same software he had called a useless toy for special needs kids was being hailed as a revolutionary breakthrough by the top tech investors in the country. Susan, always the opportunist, immediately tried to process the new information through the lens of social climbing. $40 million, she whispered, her eyes wide with newfound greed. Richard, does that mean Emily is wealthy? I mean actually wealthy. Why did she not tell us about this? We could have invited our friends from the country club. We could have hosted a massive watch party. We look like fools sitting here. She did not tell us, because she is incredibly selfish. Rachel snapped, her voice rising in pitch, drawing more stares from the dining room. She always has to make everything a secret. She probably just tricked some government panel into giving her money. It will not last. She does not know the first thing about running a real business, not like we do. She will probably bankrupt the whole thing in a month. Jamal placed his hands flat on the table. The sheer audacity of Rachel claiming to know how to run a real business while secretly embezzling from their joint accounts was the absolute final straw. He looked at the three of them sitting there stewing in their own toxic mixture of shock, jealousy, and greed. The golden child was throwing a desperate tantrum. The enabling parents were having a financial existential crisis, and the scapegoat of the family was currently shaking hands with billionaires. Jamal took a deep breath, ready to shatter their delusions completely. Jamal leaned forward, fixing his gaze entirely on his wife. He did not raise his voice, but the cold authority in his tone commanded the entire table. "You are entirely wrong," Rachel, Jamal said. "I suggest you actually read the words on your father's screen instead of making up a narrative that makes you feel better about yourself." Rachel blinked, taken aback by his incredibly sharp tone. "Excuse me," she snapped, her face flushing with immediate defensive anger. Jamal ignored her indignation. He pointed directly at the scrolling ticker on the Forbes broadcast playing silently on the white tablecloth. "That is not a charity grant for public schools. That is a massive federal endowment backed by top-tier venture capital. Emily did not trick anyone. She developed a proprietary software system from scratch, and she retained 100% of the intellectual property. Do you even understand what that means, Rachel? It means your sister is the sole CEO of a corporate entity currently valued at over $40 million. He let those words hang in the air, ensuring they struck with maximum impact. Jamal looked at Richard, who was now sweating profusely, his face a mask of absolute terror. "And you guys skipped her coronation tonight," Jamal continued, his voice dripping with quiet disgust. You completely ignored the biggest professional achievement of her life, so we could sit here and celebrate a $3,000 commission check on a condo sale that took you 6 months to close. The silence at the table was heavy and suffocating. The reality of Jamal's words hung in the air, completely destroying the fragile illusion of Rachel's superiority. Richard looked like he was going to be physically sick. He grabbed a white cloth napkin and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The power dynamic of the entire family had just violently flipped in the span of 3 minutes. Waiter Richard suddenly bellowed, completely abandoning his usual refined steakhouse demeanor. He waved his hand frantically toward the front of the restaurant, snapping his fingers. "We need the check right now. Cancel the dessert order. Bring the machine immediately." "Dad, what are you doing?" Rachel whined, her voice pitching into a shrill screech. "This is my dinner. We are supposed to be celebrating my closing. You promised me the chocolate lava cake." Richard slammed his hand flat against the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. "Shut up about the condo, Rachel," he hissed, his voice dripping with sudden venom. "Your sister is downtown with the governor and the most powerful tech investors in the state. Do you have any idea the kind of capital she is controlling right now? We have to go down there immediately. We are her family. We need to be in those press photos before the media cycle moves on." Susan nodded rapidly, immediately shifting her loyalty to wherever the most money resided. "Your father is absolutely right, Rachel. We need to show our support. Emily is probably heartbroken that we are not standing right beside her on her big night. We must go immediately and show everyone how proud we are." Jamal watched them scramble with absolute disgust. Less than an hour ago, they were laughing at my career, calling me a glorified babysitter and a charity case. Now they were practically tripping over each other to get a piece of my newfound wealth and social status. Jamal stood up and tossed his napkin onto his half-eaten steak. "I will drive you," Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. The drive to the downtown gala was incredibly tense. Jamal would later tell me it was the quietest Richard and Susan had ever been in his entire life. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, furiously refreshing her social media feeds, desperately trying to find any negative comments or corrections to the Forbes article. She muttered under her breath that the investors would eventually realize I was a fraud and that I had zero business acumen. Jamal kept his eyes firmly on the road, letting her stew in her own bitter jealousy. He knew the truth about her failing real estate agency was sitting in a manila folder in my possession, and the clock was rapidly ticking down on her fake lifestyle. They pulled up to the grand entrance of the downtown hotel. The street was completely blocked off with black luxury vehicles and local news vans. The sheer scale of the event made Rachel's steakhouse dinner look completely pathetic. Richard practically shoved his way out of the car before Jamal even put the vehicle in park. He aggressively straightened his tie and plastered on his best corporate smile, completely ready to swoop in and claim his position as the proud patriarch who made all of this possible. They marched up the red carpet, leading toward the VIP entrance of the hotel ballroom. Two massive security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces stood firmly blocking the heavy double-glass doors. A thick red velvet rope separated the elite invited guests from the general public lingering on the sidewalk. Richard walked right up to the velvet rope, fully expecting the guards to unhook it the second he arrived. "Good evening," Richard said, using his most authoritative executive voice. "We are the family of the guest of honor. I am Emily's father. Let us through." The lead security guard did not even blink. He pulled a digital tablet from his jacket pocket and calmly scrolled down the screen. "I need to see your VIP invitations, sir. Or I need your names to check against the approved entry list." Richard let out a loud, condescending chuckle. "I just told you exactly who I am. I am her father. This is her mother and her sister. We do not need an invitation to see our own flesh and blood. Go inside right now and tell Emily that Richard is here." The guard looked up from his tablet, his expression completely unchanged. "I am sorry, sir. Your names are not on the approved family entry list. The only family member currently approved for all access entry tonight is a Mr. Jamal. Richard turned bright red. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his tight collar. Rachel scoffed loudly, throwing her hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of victimhood. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Rachel snapped, glaring at the guard. "She is just doing this to embarrass us because she is petty. Go get her right now." "I am not a messenger, Mom," the guard replied, stepping slightly forward to physically block their path with his broad shoulders. "Step away from the VIP entrance immediately, or I will have you forcibly escorted off the hotel property." Inside the grand lobby, I had just finished answering questions from a prominent education journalist. The flash photography was blinding, but I felt completely grounded and in control. I was holding a glass of sparkling water, conversing with my new board members, when I heard a very familiar commotion echoing through the thick glass of the front entrance. I recognized my father's booming, arrogant voice immediately. I turned and walked slowly toward the expansive lobby doors. My executive assistant, Maria, fell into step beside me, looking slightly concerned. "Do you want me to call the local police?" Maria asked quietly, noticing the aggressive posture of the man shouting at our security team. "No, Maria," I said calmly, keeping my eyes locked on the glass doors. "That is just my family. Let me handle this right now." I pushed open the inner doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The lingering press photographers immediately turned their cameras toward me, sensing fresh drama unfolding on the red carpet. I stood firmly behind the velvet rope, looking at the three of them standing on the sidewalk, completely desperate for a piece of the spotlight they had tried so hard to deny me. Richard tried to play the role of the proud patriarch. He leaned over the heavy velvet rope, extending his arms wide as if he fully expected me to rush into his embrace. "Emily, sweetheart." He projected his voice so the nearest journalist could capture the audio. "Tell these security guards who we are. They are trying to keep your own family out of your celebration." Susan immediately flanked him, nodding vigorously to the press. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, honey," she chimed in, her voice dripping with manufactured affection. "We rushed over from dinner the second we heard the amazing news. We would never miss the most important night of your life." Rachel stood slightly behind them, trying to angle her face to catch the flashes from the press cameras, while simultaneously glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. She was physically incapable of letting me have the spotlight even for a minute. I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still, letting the cool night breeze rustle the fabric of my suit. The press photographers, realizing that a major confrontation was happening rapidly, closed the distance. The clicking of camera shutters sounded like a swarm of mechanical locusts. A few journalists pulled out their digital recorders and pointed them toward the velvet rope. I looked directly at Richard. His smile was strained. His eyes were wide with a desperate, silent plea for me to play along to protect his public image. He was a man who survived on his reputation in the corporate world. But I had spent my entire life protecting his image while he actively destroyed my self-worth. That arrangement was officially over. I did not whisper. I spoke clearly and with absolute surgical precision, ensuring every single microphone picked up my words. "You are not coming inside, Richard," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. The fake smile vanished from his face instantly. "What are you talking about, Emily?" he stammered, taking a step back as if I had physically struck him. "I am your father. I funded your education. I supported your dreams." I tilted my head, looking at him with nothing but pure pity. "Do not lie to the press, Richard," I replied. "Exactly 3 hours ago, I texted you asking if you were coming to my award ceremony. You replied that I was just a teacher and that investing in me was equivalent to burning money. You explicitly chose to skip the most important night of my life so you could go eat steak and celebrate Rachel's mediocre condo sale." A collective gasp rippled through the small group of reporters gathered near the entrance. Several of them immediately began typing frantically on their phones, capturing the unfolding drama for their evening publications. Richard turned ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around wildly, realizing that his reputation as a supportive family man was disintegrating in real time. Susan clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest, her eyes darting nervously toward the flashing cameras. "Emily, how can you do this to us?" Susan pleaded, trying to sound like a victim. "We are your family. We love you. We let you live in our home while you built this business. You love my newly acquired net worth." "Susan," I corrected her smoothly, "you do not love me. You never have. And you certainly have no place in my foundation." I turned my gaze to the lead security guard. "Security, they are not on the guest list. And they are causing a disturbance. Please ensure they do not cross that rope." The two massive security guards immediately stepped forward, crossing their broad arms intimidatingly. Rachel finally snapped. The realization that she was completely locked out of the elite circle she craved so desperately broke her fragile ego. She lunged forward, grabbing the velvet rope with both hands. "You little witch!" she screamed, completely abandoning her carefully curated public persona. "You think just because you scammed the government out of some money that you are better than us. You are nothing. You have always been nothing but a glorified babysitter." I ignored my sister completely. My eyes bypassed my screaming family and landed directly on Jamal. He was standing a few feet back near the edge of the red carpet, observing the entire spectacle with quiet, intense calculation. Jamal was the only person standing on that sidewalk who possessed an ounce of integrity. I raised my hand, signaling the security guards to pause for a moment. I stepped right up to the velvet rope, closing the distance between myself and the family that had discarded me. I reached into the oversized leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was sealed with a single piece of tape. I extended my arm, reaching past Richard's trembling shoulder, and held the folder out toward Jamal. "Jamal," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "You are the only one on the approved entry list tonight. You are welcome to come inside and join the VIP reception. But before you do, you need to look at what is inside this folder." Jamal stepped forward, his eyes locked on the thick envelope. He completely ignored Richard, who was weakly trying to block his path. Jamal reached out and took the folder from my hand. It felt heavy with undeniable truths. "What is that?" Rachel demanded, her voice suddenly wavering with genuine panic. "What did you just give my husband, Emily? What lies are you spreading about me?" I looked right into Rachel's eyes and watched the color rapidly drain from her perfectly contoured face. "I gave him the absolute truth, Rachel," I said simply. I turned my attention back to Jamal, who was already breaking the tape seal with his thumb. "Check the portfolio inside, Jamal," I instructed him calmly. "As a corporate auditor, I know you will deeply appreciate the meticulous bookkeeping. I bought the debt of Rachel's luxury real estate agency 3 weeks ago through a proxy shell company. I did it to ensure my own assets were completely protected from my family before this endowment went public." Rachel let out a horrified shriek. "You did what?" she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. "Your wife did not sell a condo today, Jamal." I continued, speaking over Rachel's, panicked, hyperventilating. "She remortgaged your shared home to cover her massive embezzlements. She has been siphoning your joint retirement accounts for the past 8 months to fund a fake, luxurious lifestyle to impress Richard and Susan. The bank statements, the forged signatures, the second mortgage documents, they are all in there. Every single cent is mathematically accounted for." The entire red carpet fell dead silent. Even the press photographers lowered their cameras, realizing they were witnessing the total, catastrophic destruction of a marriage. Jamal opened the folder right there under the glowing hotel marquee lights. His highly trained eyes scanned the first page of the financial summary. The neat rows of numbers confirmed every single suspicion he had been harboring for the past 6 months. His face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute disgust. Richard stared at Rachel, his jaw dropping open. "You remortgaged the house?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You told us your agency was expanding. You told us you were making record sales." Rachel was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Dad, I can explain," she sobbed, reaching out toward him. "I just needed a temporary bridge loan. The market was slow. I was going to pay it all back." Jamal flipped to the second page, holding up a copy of a document with a highlighted signature block. "You forged my signature on a loan document," Rachel Jamal said, his voice lethally calm. "You committed federal fraud to buy designer clothes and expensive dinners just so you could look successful on social media." "Jamal, I am so sorry," Rachel cried, trying to grab his arm. "Please let us go home and talk about this. Do not do this here. Do not touch me," Jamal snapped, pulling his arm away as if she were made of toxic waste. Susan, realizing that her golden child was suddenly a massive legal liability, immediately tried to do damage control. She pushed past Rachel and practically threw herself against the velvet rope, reaching for me. "Emily, you have to help us," Susan begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have $40 million now. You can pay off her debt. You can fix this. We gave you everything. We let you live in our basement when you were starting this project. You owe us." Instead of getting emotional or angry, I simply pulled my digital tablet from my portfolio. I woke the screen and navigated to an application I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I tapped an icon, and the massive digital presentation screen in the hotel lobby directly behind the glass doors flickered to life. The display was large enough for everyone on the red carpet, including the press, to see perfectly clearly. The high-definition screen illuminated the faces of the stunned crowd. I had synced my tablet to display a very simple side-by-side financial comparison. On the left side of the screen were 12 consecutive digital receipts. Each one showed a transfer of exactly $1,500 from my modest checking account directly into Susan's personal bank account. The memo line on every single transfer clearly read "basement rent." On the right side of the screen was a single massive wire transfer document. It showed $80,000 moving from Richard's corporate checking account to a luxury resort in Cabo San Lucas. I turned to face my mother, who was now staring up at the giant screen with absolute horror. "You did not give me anything, Susan," I said, my voice amplifying across the quiet street. "You charged me $1,500 a month to live in a flooded, unfinished basement with black mold while I worked 80-hour weeks to build this company. And in that exact same year, you handed Rachel $80,000 in cash for a destination wedding. Do not ever stand in front of the press and pretend you were a supportive mother. I did not build this empire because of you. I built it to escape you." The cameras flashed frantically, capturing the undeniable proof of their hypocrisy. Susan's perfectly curated country club facade crumbled instantly. She shrank back against Richard, hiding her face behind her designer handbag, completely unable to defend herself against the raw mathematics of her own favoritism. Jamal stood quietly, taking in the full measure of the toxic family he had married into. He looked down at the manila folder in his hands, holding the undeniable proof of his wife's financial crimes. Then he looked up at the giant screen displaying the parents' blatant financial abuse of their youngest daughter. The sheer disgust on his face was absolute. He realized that this entire family was built on a foundation of lies, exploitation, and appearances. Jamal stepped forward, approaching the velvet rope. He pulled his driver's license from his wallet and showed it to the lead security guard. The guard checked his digital list, nodded respectfully, and unhooked the rope. Jamal stepped across the threshold, leaving his weeping wife standing on the sidewalk. Just inside the lobby doors, a waiter was standing holding a silver tray lined with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. Jamal reached out and took a glass. He did not drink from it. Instead, he calmly gripped his left hand and pulled the heavy gold wedding band off his ring finger. Rachel let out a loud, agonizing sob. "Jamal, please do not do this," she begged, reaching her arms over the velvet rope. "We can fix this. I can explain everything." Jamal held the glass out, suspending the gold ring directly over the bubbling liquid. He looked at Richard, his expression colder than ice. "You raised a fraud," Richard Jamal said, his voice carrying clearly to the street. "Your golden child is a thief and a manipulative liar. Have fun paying her federal legal fees." Jamal opened his fingers and dropped the ring. It hit the bottom of the crystal flute with a sharp, definitive clink. He placed the glass onto a nearby cocktail table and walked through the heavy double doors into the VIP reception without ever looking back. The reality of the situation finally crushed Richard. He was rapidly losing everything. His son-in-law was leaving, taking his lucrative salary with him. His golden child was facing federal fraud charges and massive crippling debt. And the daughter he had treated like garbage was now untouchable, holding $40 million just out of his reach. Richard did what he always did when his back was against the wall. He threw his own family under the bus to save himself. Richard forcefully shoved Rachel away from him. "Get off of me!" he snarled at his favorite daughter, his face twisted with rage. "You lied to us. You stole from your own husband. You are an absolute disgrace." Rachel gasped, stumbling backward in her expensive high heels. Her face contorted in total shock. For 35 years she had been the center of Richard's universe solely because she fed his ego. Now, within a matter of minutes, she was watching him toss her aside like actual garbage just to protect himself. She looked at our mother, expecting Susan to defend her, but Susan simply looked at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, completely terrified of losing her own comfortable lifestyle. "Dad," Rachel whimpered, her voice breaking. Richard completely ignored her. He immediately spun back toward the velvet rope, plastering a desperate, frantic smile on his sweating face. He focused all his attention back on me. "Emily, sweetheart, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dripping with sudden, sickening sweetness. "I always knew Rachel was irresponsible. She manipulated your mother and me. We did not know what she was doing. We were victims of her lies too. But you, Emily, you are brilliant. You have always been brilliant." I stood perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave in front of the press and his favorite daughter. Richard leaned closer over the rope, lowering his voice into what he thought was a persuasive corporate tone. "You are going to need help managing a $40 million federal endowment, Emily. You are a teacher. You do not know how ruthless the corporate world can be. The investors will eat you alive. Let me manage your foundation's portfolio. You need a real businessman in your corner, someone you can trust. Let me step in as your chief financial director. I can double that money in a year. We can be a team, just you and me." I let the silence stretch. I let Rachel hear every single word of her father betraying her, sacrificing her to the wolves the second she was no longer financially viable to his ego. The toxic family unit was completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces right there on the red carpet. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once, stopping the hidden audio recording application I had secretly started the moment I walked out of the lobby doors. I looked at Richard, admiring the sheer audacity of his greed. I held up my phone, showing him the audio file I had just saved to my secure cloud server. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "I think the board of directors will find this recording very interesting, Richard," I said smoothly. "A man willing to sell out his own daughter on a public sidewalk for a paycheck is not exactly the kind of fiduciary responsibility we are looking for." Rachel let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She lunged forward, her expensive stiletto heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Do not look at that, Jamal!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "She is a jealous liar. She has always been jealous of me. She just printed out a bunch of fake papers to ruin my night because she cannot stand that we were celebrating my success." Jamal did not even blink. He smoothly shifted his weight and stepped out of her reach, holding the thick manila folder securely out of her grasp. As a senior corporate auditor, Jamal spent 50 hours a week hunting down financial discrepancies for Fortune 500 companies. He knew exactly what a forged document looked like, and he knew exactly what airtight legal paperwork looked like. He pulled the red pull tab and opened the flap of the envelope right there under the glowing hotel marquee lights. The first document he pulled out was the certificate of debt transfer. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal jargon, instantly comprehending what he was looking at. 3 weeks ago, when the $40 million federal endowment was moving into the final approval stages, my legal team had strongly advised me to aggressively secure my personal assets. They ran a comprehensive background check on my immediate family members to ensure there were no financial liabilities that could somehow attach themselves to my new corporate structure. What my lawyers found was a catastrophic financial sinkhole disguised as a luxury real estate agency. Rachel's business was in massive default. She had not made a legitimate sale in over 6 months. Her office lease was months behind, and her creditors were preparing to file aggressive lawsuits. The biggest problem was that Richard had co-signed her initial $2 million business loan. If Rachel went bankrupt, the creditors would immediately go after Richard. And if Richard faced financial ruin, I knew exactly what he would do. He would come directly after my newly acquired wealth, claiming family obligation. I refused to let my empire be threatened by her incompetence. So I hired a proxy firm to create an anonymous shell company. Through that proxy, I bought the entirety of Rachel's corporate debt for pennies on the dollar. I legally became her primary creditor, and she had absolutely no idea. I owned the walls she worked in, and I owned the desk she sat at. Jamal flipped to the second page of the portfolio. His face, which was usually warm and expressive, hardened into a mask of pure cold marble. The street noise, the flashing cameras, and Richard's frantic pacing seemed to completely fade away for Jamal as he entered his element. He was looking at the ledgers, the undeniable, completely mathematically sound ledgers of his own financial ruin at the hands of his wife. "This is a second mortgage," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low octave. He did not look at Rachel. He kept his eyes glued to the paper. "You took out a second mortgage on our primary residence." Rachel was practically hyperventilating. Her face was flushed dark red, and tears were ruining her expensive makeup. "Jamal, please," she begged, her hands hovering in the air, wanting to grab him, but terrified of his reaction. It was just a temporary bridge loan. The housing market was experiencing a downturn. I just needed some liquid capital to keep the agency afloat until the spring buying season. I was going to pay it back. Jamal flipped to the next page. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the hotel entrance. "Liquid capital to keep the agency afloat," he repeated, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. He held up a bank statement highlighted in bright yellow ink. "You drained $35,000 from our joint savings account to lease a Porsche. You told me and everyone else in this family that you bought that car in cash from your record-breaking commissions. You told me the agency was thriving." Richard, who had been standing a few feet away trying to figure out how to salvage his own image, suddenly snapped his head toward his golden child. "You leased the Porsche?" Richard demanded, his voice tight with sudden panic. "You told me you owned it outright." Jamal ignored Richard, completely flipping to the next page of the nightmare folder. The hits just kept coming. Every single luxury item Rachel had flaunted over the past year was thoroughly documented and exposed. She had secretly liquidated a portion of Jamal's corporate retirement fund to buy Susan a vintage Rolex watch for her birthday. Susan instinctively grabbed her left wrist, covering the heavy gold watch she was currently wearing. Her eyes widened as she suddenly realized she was parading around in stolen property funded by her son-in-law's drained retirement account. She had maxed out 4 different credit cards in Jamal's name to pay for exclusive country club memberships and lavish vacations to Cabo San Lucas just to maintain the illusion of overwhelming success on her social media profiles. She was not closing million-dollar properties. She was systematically bleeding her own husband dry to impress parents who only loved her for her perceived wealth. "Those are fake," Rachel screamed desperately, trying to gaslight the man who looked at bank statements for a living. "She hacked my accounts. She fabricated all of this." Jamal, you know me. I am your wife. You cannot believe her over me. Jamal finally looked up from the folder. He looked at Rachel not as a husband looking at his wife, but as an auditor looking at a convicted fraudster. He pulled a specific document from the back of the stack and shoved it directly in front of her face. "Look at the routing numbers, Rachel," he commanded, his voice slicing through the cool night air like a razor blade. "Look at the signature block on the mortgage agreement. That is your handwriting trying to mimic mine. You even used the same fake notary stamp that you used to expedite your real estate closings. Do not insult my intelligence by telling me this is fabricated. You committed federal wire fraud. You stole my future to buy designer handbags." Rachel stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of the evidence left no room for manipulation or deceit. Her entire identity, her status as the perfect golden child, the successful businesswoman, the wealthy daughter, was completely annihilated in the span of 3 minutes. Richard began doing the brutal corporate math in his own head. The reality of the co-signed business loan hit him like a physical blow to the chest. If Rachel had no money and her agency was failing, the massive debt was going to fall entirely on his shoulders. He looked at Rachel with pure, unadulterated revulsion, realizing she was no longer his trophy child, but a massive financial liability that could destroy his retirement. I stood quietly behind the velvet rope, watching the house of cards collapse exactly as I knew it would. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. I had simply handed them the mirror they had refused to look into for their entire lives. Jamal slowly lowered the folder, his hands gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked over his shoulder at Richard and Susan, who were standing frozen in horror. The truth was completely out in the open, and there was absolutely no way to put the pieces back together. The cold night air felt completely still. Jamal was standing there holding the absolute destruction of Rachel's life in his hands. That was the exact moment my mother Susan finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She looked at Rachel, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the concrete sidewalk. Then she looked at Richard, who was already mentally calculating his own bankruptcy now that he was tied to Rachel's failing agency. Susan realized with terrifying clarity that the luxurious safety net she had enjoyed for decades was rapidly burning to the ground. She turned her eyes toward me. I was standing safely behind the velvet rope, flanked by security and success. In her twisted mind, I was no longer the family disappointment. I was a $40 million life raft, and she was fully prepared to sink her claws into me to stay afloat. Susan lunged forward. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy, completely ignoring the heavy velvet rope and the massive security guards. One of the guards immediately stepped into her path, raising a broad hand to stop her, but she ducked under his arm. She lunged across the threshold and grabbed the sleeve of my tailored navy suit. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into the expensive fabric. "Wait," I told the security guard who was about to physically remove her. "Let her speak." I wanted the lingering press to capture every single desperate word she was about to say. "Emily, how could you do this to your own sister?" Susan cried out, her voice vibrating with a sickening mixture of anger and fake tears. She squeezed my arm tightly, trying to pull me closer to her level of hysteria. "Family is supposed to protect family. You just humiliated Rachel in front of everyone. You destroyed her marriage over a few silly financial mistakes." I stared down at her hand gripping my jacket. "A few silly financial mistakes." I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "She committed federal wire fraud, Susan. She stole her husband's retirement. She forged legal documents to buy designer clothes." "That does not matter," Susan shrieked, completely dismissing the law in favor of her own warped family dynamics. "We would have figured it out. Your father could have fixed it. But you just had to make a public spectacle. You are so incredibly selfish, Emily. You have always been selfish. We gave you absolutely everything. We sacrificed for you. We let you live in our home in our basement when you were starting this little project of yours, and this is how you repay us, By stabbing your sister in the back the second you get your hands on some money. I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her expensive stolen Rolex watch, and the righteous indignation burning in her eyes. She genuinely believed her own lies. She had rewritten history so many times that she actually thought of herself as a benevolent, loving mother who had graciously sheltered a struggling child. I did not yell. I did not pull my arm away. I simply reached into my portfolio with my free hand and pulled out my digital tablet. I tapped the screen, waking it up, and opened a specific file folder I had kept backed up on multiple servers for the past 5 years. "Let us talk about your incredible sacrifices, Susan," I said smoothly, turning the brightness on the tablet all the way up. I held the glowing screen directly in front of her face, forcing her to look at it. Displayed on the screen was a scanned copy of a heavily detailed residential lease agreement. It was dated 5 years ago. At the very bottom were two signatures, mine and hers. "Do you remember this document, Mother?" I asked, my tone completely flat and professional. "This is the legally binding lease agreement you forced me to sign the very day I moved back into your house to start my company. You did not let me live with you. You acted as a hostile corporate landlord." Susan blinked rapidly, trying to turn her head away from the bright screen, but I stepped closer, keeping the undeniable proof right in her line of sight. "You charged me $1,500 a month to live in an unfinished basement." I continued, making sure my voice carried over the ambient noise of the street. But it was not just unfinished, was it? It had no central heating. The concrete floors flooded every time it rained. The drywall was infested with black mold that gave me chronic bronchitis for 6 straight months. Susan swallowed hard, her grip on my sleeve loosening slightly. "Emily, that is not fair," she stammered, her voice dropping an octave as she noticed the journalist leaning in to listen. "We were just trying to teach you financial responsibility. We wanted you to understand the value of hard work. We could not just give you a free ride while you were playing around with computers in the dark." I swiped my finger across the tablet screen, bringing up a new document. This one was a digital spreadsheet accompanied by dozens of scanned repair invoices and banking statements. "Teaching me responsibility," I echoed, letting out a short, cold laugh. "You charged me premium market rent for a biological hazard zone. And when the ancient water heater broke, flooding the basement with 2 inches of filthy water, you refused to call a plumber. You told me that since I was the tenant, the maintenance was entirely my financial responsibility. I had to drain my meager savings account to pay for a commercial water extractor just so my computer servers would not be destroyed. I ate ramen noodles for 3 months to pay that plumber, while you and Richard went on a 2-week wine tasting tour in Tuscany." Susan was completely cornered by her own documented cruelty. She opened her mouth to argue, but there was absolutely no defense against the digital receipts staring back at her. The press cameras continued to flash, capturing the moment her grand illusion of motherhood was dismantled. I swiped the screen one final time. The display changed to show a side-by-side comparison of 2 bank transfers made during that exact same year. "Look closely at these numbers, Susan," I commanded, pointing at the screen. "On the left is the total amount of rent you extracted from my bank account while I was living in a moldy basement trying to build a future. $18,000. Now look at the right side of the screen. That is the exact amount of cash you and Richard freely gifted to Rachel that very same year, so she could have a lavish destination wedding in Mexico. $80,000. I finally reached up and grabbed Susan's wrist. I squeezed it firmly and peeled her manicured fingers off my suit jacket. "You never supported my project, Susan. You actively profited off my struggle. You used my monthly rent payments to subsidize your golden child's extravagant lifestyle. You taxed my poverty to fund her delusions of grandeur." Susan took a shaky step backward. The press cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the absolute horror on her face as her maternal facade was completely and permanently shattered. She looked around desperately, hoping anyone would jump to her defense. But Richard was staring at the ground, entirely consumed by his own impending financial doom. Rachel was sitting on the pavement, completely broken and humiliated by her own husband. You did not give me everything I told her, delivering the final crushing blow to her ego. You gave me absolutely nothing but obstacles. And I built a $40 million empire out of the bricks you constantly threw at my head. So do not ever touch me again, and do not ever pretend you had anything to do with my success. You are nothing but a terrible landlord who just got permanently evicted from my life. Susan stumbled backward, as if the physical force of my words had literally pushed her. The blinding flashes of the press cameras illuminated the absolute terror on her perfectly contoured face. She realized in that exact moment that she had not just lost a daughter. She had permanently lost access to a $40 million empire because she could not resist being cruel. She covered her face with her hands and retreated toward Rachel, who was still sitting on the cold concrete, entirely paralyzed by her own exposed fraud. Richard, however, was a completely different breed of monster. He was a man who had spent his entire life climbing corporate ladders, stepping on anyone who got in his way. Seeing his wife and his golden child completely neutralized did not make him want to comfort them. It simply made him realize they were dead weight. Richard aggressively straightened his expensive silk tie. He stepped over Rachel's outstretched legs, completely ignoring his sobbing daughter. He walked back up to the velvet rope, plastering on a horrifyingly calm corporate smile. "Emily, please excuse your mother and sister," Richard said, his voice dropping into a smooth, persuasive cadence, as if we were sitting in a private boardroom. "They are highly emotional creatures. They do not understand the complexities of high-level business. But you and I do. We are the same Emily. We are visionaries." I stared at him, feeling a deep, profound disgust bubbling in my chest. "You and I are absolutely nothing alike, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He waved his hand dismissively, ignoring my statement. "Look at what you have built," he continued, gesturing toward the grand hotel lobby. "It is incredible, but $40 million is a massive target on your back. You are a teacher, Emily. You are not equipped to handle the wolves in this industry. They will smile to your face and drain your accounts. You need a shark in your corner. You need someone who shares your blood to protect your assets. Let me be your chief financial officer. I have 30 years of corporate executive experience. I can double your endowment in 5 years." I let his words hang in the cool night air. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He was standing on the sidewalk, actively facing personal bankruptcy because he had co-signed a fraudulent loan for his favorite daughter, and his immediate solution was to try and take control of my company. I looked at the journalists who were leaning over the rope, eagerly recording every single syllable of his desperate pitch. "You want to be my chief financial officer?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly," Richard said, eagerly nodding his head. "I will manage the portfolio. You can focus on the software and the charity work. Leave the big money to me." "Richard," I said slowly, leaning slightly forward, "you co-signed a $2 million commercial loan without doing a basic forensic audit on your own daughter's agency. You funded a destination wedding instead of diversifying your own retirement portfolio. You are currently wearing a stolen Rolex watch purchased with embezzled funds. You are not a shark. You are a massive financial liability." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry purple. "Emily, do not be stupid," he hissed, his voice losing its polished edge. "You cannot run an empire without an experienced executive team. You will fail without me." I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. "I already have an incredibly experienced executive team, Richard. In fact, my board of directors officially approved the contract for my new chief financial officer this morning. He is a brilliant corporate auditor with an absolutely flawless track record." Richard scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Who did you hire? Some kid from Silicon Valley. Some tech bro who is going to steal your intellectual property. You are making a massive mistake." Before I could answer, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP reception swung open. The warm glow of the party spilled out into the lobby. Jamal stepped out holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a crisp white dress shirt. He looked completely transformed. The heavy burden of his toxic marriage was entirely gone, leaving behind a man who was confident, powerful, and completely in his element. Jamal walked over to where I was standing and took his place firmly by my side. "Good evening, Richard," Jamal said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who held all the winning cards. Richard stared at Jamal in absolute confusion. "What are you doing out here, Jamal?" Richard demanded. "Get back here and help your wife. She is having a nervous breakdown on the sidewalk." Jamal did not even glance in Rachel's direction. "My wife committed federal wire fraud and destroyed our marriage," Richard Jamal replied smoothly. "My lawyers will be handling her from now on, but to answer your question, I am out here because my CEO needed me." Richard blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the information. "Your CEO?" he repeated dumbly. I gestured toward Jamal. "Richard, I would like to officially introduce you to the new Chief Financial Officer of my foundation. Jamal has spent the last decade hunting down corporate fraud for Fortune 500 companies. He is meticulous, he is brilliant, and most importantly, he is the only person in this family who ever treated me with an ounce of genuine respect." The realization hit Richard like a physical blow to the stomach. He stumbled back a step, grabbing the brass post of the velvet rope to steady himself. "You hired him," Richard gasped. Rachel, who had been crying on the ground, suddenly scrambled to her feet. Her face was smeared with black mascara, and her expensive dress was stained with street dirt. "You cannot do that!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You cannot steal my husband! He is mine!" Jamal finally looked at Rachel. His eyes were completely devoid of any affection. "You stole my future, Rachel," Jamal said, his voice cold and final. "Emily simply offered me a position that values my integrity. You and I are entirely finished. Do not ever contact me again unless it is through my legal counsel." Rachel let out a horrifying wail and collapsed into Susan's arms. Susan just stood there, trembling, completely unable to comprehend how her perfect family had been utterly destroyed in less than an hour. Richard was hyperventilating. His chest heaved as he stared at the empire he could never touch and the wealth he could never control. He had nothing left to say. His manipulation tactics were useless against undeniable facts. I looked at the three of them standing on the dirty sidewalk outside the most exclusive party in the city. The family that had mocked me, belittled me, and treated me like a worthless burden was now completely broken and entirely bankrupt. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I held it up, letting the streetlights illuminate the green paper. I looked directly into Richard's eyes and dropped the bill. It fluttered gracefully over the velvet rope and landed perfectly at the toe of his expensive Italian leather shoes. Here I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute finality. "This is for an Uber pool back to the steakhouse. Or maybe you can use it to buy a book on filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. My foundation does not associate with bad investments, and I do not associate with toxic people." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on them. Jamal turned with me. Together we walked away from the flashing cameras and the screaming and the years of generational trauma. We stepped through the heavy double doors into the bright, warm light of the VIP reception. The security guards immediately pulled the doors shut behind us. The heavy glass and mahogany sealed with a solid, definitive click, completely locking my toxic family out of my life forever. Rachel watched her mother Susan retreat in absolute defeat. The realization that I was completely untouchable finally pierced through Rachel's thick layer of delusion. But instead of accepting reality and walking away with whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left, she panicked. She turned her wild, desperate eyes back to Jamal, who was still holding the thick manila folder containing the undeniable proof of her federal wire fraud and embezzlement. Rachel began hyperventilating. Her chest heaved rapidly, and she let out a series of sharp, gasping breaths that echoed loudly in the cool night air. She lunged forward, her manicured hands clawing frantically at the space between them, trying to snatch the folder from Jamal's firm grip. "Give it back to me, Jamal!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill pitch. "You cannot keep that. It is mine. It is my private property, and you have no right to look at it." Jamal did not even flinch. As a man who maintained meticulous discipline in every aspect of his professional and personal life, he simply sidestepped her frantic assault. He held the heavy folder easily out of her reach. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked down at his wife, the woman he had vowed to protect and cherish, and saw nothing but a desperate, greedy stranger who had systematically dismantled his entire financial future behind his back. "Stop it, Rachel!" Jamal commanded, his voice booming with a heavy authority that completely silenced her screaming. "Do not embarrass yourself any further in front of these cameras. It is far too late for you to play the victim. The paper trail is already established and secured. You cannot unwrite the forged signatures, and you certainly cannot unspend the hundreds of thousands of dollars you stole from our joint retirement accounts." Rachel collapsed onto her knees right there on the dirty concrete of the red carpet, sobbing uncontrollably. The flashing lights of the press cameras intensified, capturing every single humiliating second of her public breakdown. She wrapped her arms around Jamal's legs, burying her tear-streaked face in his tailored trousers. "Please, Jamal," she begged, her words muffled and pathetic. "I only did it for us. I wanted us to look successful. I wanted my parents to be proud of me. I was going to pay it all back from my next big commission, I swear to you." Jamal looked down at her, completely unmoved by her theatrical display of remorse. "You did not do this for us, Rachel," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm and steady. "You did this entirely for yourself. You weaponized my 10 years of hard work to feed your own pathetic ego. You drained my retirement fund so you could buy designer watches and lease European sports cars just to impress a father who only values you for your perceived net worth." Jamal reached down and firmly peeled her hands off his legs, stepping back to create a solid physical boundary between them. "Our entire marriage was nothing but a financial trap," Jamal continued, speaking clearly, so the journalists pressing against the velvet rope could record every single word. "You did not want a partner, Rachel. You wanted a sponsor. You wanted a blind, blank check to fund your absolute delusions of grandeur." Richard, who was still standing nearby, trying to mentally calculate the collateral damage to his own corporate reputation, suddenly stepped forward to intervene. "Now wait just a minute, Jamal," Richard said, holding up his hands in a fake placating gesture. "Let us not be too hasty here. Rachel made some terrible mistakes, yes, but we can handle this internally like professionals. We can hire a team of forensic accountants to quietly restructure her debt. We are family, Jamal. We protect our own." Jamal turned his piercing gaze toward Richard. The sheer audacity of the older man was absolutely staggering. "You raised a fraud," Richard, Jamal said, his tone slicing through the tension like a newly sharpened blade. "You created this monster standing here. You set impossible standards of shallow materialism, and you actively rewarded her for being a manipulative liar her entire life. You co-signed that original business loan because you wanted to brag to your country club friends about your highly successful daughter. Well, now you get to brag about her federal fraud indictments. Have fun paying her massive legal fees, Richard, because I will not be spending another single dime on this toxic family." A waiter from the VIP reception had stepped out onto the red carpet to observe the commotion, carrying a silver tray lined with crystal flutes of expensive champagne meant for the arriving elite guests. Jamal calmly reached out and took one of the tall, elegant glasses. He held it in his left hand, the sparkling golden liquid catching the ambient light of the hotel marquee. With his right hand, Jamal deliberately reached over and gripped his gold wedding band. He did not rush the movement. He made absolute sure that Rachel, who was staring up at him from the concrete, was watching his every single move. He pulled the ring over his knuckle. The heavy gold band slid off his finger completely, severing the legal and emotional ties to the weeping woman at his feet. Jamal held the ring suspended directly over the bubbling crystal flute. I am filing for divorce the second the courthouse opens in the morning, Rachel. Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. My lawyers will be in contact with whatever cheap public defender your father can afford to hire for you. He opened his fingers. The gold ring dropped into the champagne. It hit the bottom of the delicate glass with a sharp, definitive clink that sounded louder than a gunshot. He leaned over and carefully placed the flute onto the pavement right next to Rachel's trembling hands. It was a cold, symbolic toast to the absolute end of her fake, luxurious lifestyle. Jamal then turned toward the heavy velvet rope that separated the elite guests from the frantic, desperate chaos of the street. The two massive security guards immediately stepped forward, their broad shoulders blocking the VIP entrance. One of them raised a firm hand to stop him. Sir, no one else is permitted entry, the guard stated professionally. Jamal did not argue. He calmly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick premium cardstock envelope. It was sealed with gold wax featuring the official stamped emblem of my newly endowed educational foundation. I had mailed it directly to his private auditing office earlier that week, completely bypassing Rachel and her constant neurotic surveillance of their home mail. Jamal handed the envelope to the lead security guard. The guard broke the wax seal and pulled out the all-access VIP pass inside. He scanned the custom barcode with his digital tablet. The device emitted a pleasant green chime, instantly validating the high-tier credential. The guard looked up, his stern expression immediately softening into a respectful nod. Welcome to the reception, Mr. Jamal, he said, unhooking the heavy brass clasp of the velvet rope and stepping aside to clear the path. Rachel let out a horrifying, agonizing wail as she watched her husband, the man she had financially abused and constantly belittled, step effortlessly over the threshold into the world of extreme wealth and power that she was permanently locked out of. She tried to scramble to her feet, lunging toward the opening in the rope, but the security guards immediately closed the gap, hooking the brass clasp back into place and physically blocking her path with their bodies. Ma'am, you need to step back right now, the guard warned, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. Jamal stood on the other side of the velvet rope, completely untouchable. He looked at me standing quietly in the lobby, radiating an aura of total control and massive success. He gave me a subtle nod of profound gratitude. I had not just exposed a massive corporate fraud tonight. I had handed him the key to his own personal freedom. He turned his back on the screaming woman he used to call his wife and walked confidently into the warm, glowing light of the VIP party, leaving the absolute wreckage of my toxic family burning on the sidewalk. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind Jamal, sealing him safely inside the warm, glowing light of the exclusive reception. The click of the brass latch echoed loudly over the quiet street. I remained standing just behind the velvet rope, flanked by my security team, watching the aftermath of the explosion I had just detonated. Rachel was still kneeling on the cold concrete, her hands gripping the hem of her ruined designer dress. She was sobbing hysterically, calling out Jamal's name, but the sound barely carried over the ambient noise of the downtown traffic. Susan stood a few feet away, completely paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth in absolute shock. But it was Richard who commanded my full attention. I watched his face undergo a terrifying transformation. The realization of what Jamal's departure actually meant was crashing down on his shoulders in real time. Jamal was not just a husband to Rachel. He was the primary income earner, the financial anchor that was keeping her fraudulent lifestyle afloat. With Jamal gone and the embezzlement completely exposed, Rachel's real estate agency was effectively dead. And Richard had personally co-signed the $2 million commercial loan that started it all. The panic in Richard's eyes rapidly curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man who worshipped his own comfort and status above all else. He had spent his entire life carefully building a reputation as a wealthy, successful patriarch. Now he was staring directly down the barrel of personal bankruptcy and public humiliation, all because he had blindly trusted his golden child. Richard suddenly moved. He stepped aggressively toward Rachel, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the pavement. "Get up!" He barked, his voice entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the cold, ruthless tone he used when firing subordinate employees. Rachel flinched, looking up at him with dark mascara-stained tears running down her cheeks. "Daddy, please," she whimpered, reaching a trembling hand toward his pant leg. "I need your help. We have to call a lawyer. We have to fix this right now." Richard did not reach out to help her up. He stood towering over her, his face twisted in absolute disgust. "Fix this," he repeated, his voice rising to a furious shout that made the nearby press photographers flinch. "How exactly do you propose we fix $2 million in defaulted commercial debt, Rachel? You lied to me. You sat at my dinner table for the last 3 years, drinking my expensive wine, telling me your agency was closing record-breaking deals. You told me you were expanding into commercial properties. I was trying to make you proud," Rachel sobbed, wrapping her arms around her own stomach, as if she were in physical pain. The market shifted. "I just needed more time to close a big account. You needed a wealthy husband to steal from and a stupid father to co-sign your loans," Richard snarled, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You are a parasite, Rachel. You have never worked a hard day in your miserable life. I paid for your private schools. I paid for your luxury car. I paid $80,000 for your ridiculous destination wedding because you convinced me you were a winner. But you are not a winner. You are a massive financial liability, and you have completely ruined my retirement." Susan finally found her voice, stepping forward tentatively. "Richard, stop it," Susan pleaded, her voice shaking as she looked around at the gathering crowd. "People are watching us. The journalists are right there taking pictures." Richard snapped his head toward his wife, his eyes blazing with fury. "Shut up, Susan," he roared, completely abandoning any pretense of upper-class dignity. "This is your fault, too. You coddled her. You taught her that she deserved the world on a silver platter just for being pretty. Well, look at her now. She is a convicted felon waiting to happen, and I am not going down with her." Rachel gasped, placing her hands flat on the pavement as if the ground had suddenly given way beneath her. "Daddy, you cannot abandon me," she cried, her voice breaking into a hysterical shriek. "I am your daughter. I am your favorite. You always said I was your greatest investment." Richard looked at her with eyes as cold and dead as a winter lake. "You were an investment," he agreed, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "And you just tanked. I am cutting my losses immediately. I will not spend a single dime of my own money paying for your criminal defense attorneys. Do not call my house. Do not ask me for a loan. You are entirely on your own." The sheer brutality of his words hung heavily in the air. Rachel let out a low, agonizing moan and curled into a ball on the sidewalk, completely shattered. The golden child had finally been discarded the absolute second her gold plating rubbed off. Richard slowly stood up straight. He adjusted his silk tie and smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket, taking a deep breath to physically rein in his explosive anger. He turned his back on the weeping wreckage of his favorite daughter and his paralyzed wife. He walked deliberately back toward the velvet rope where I was standing. I watched him approach, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical fascination. The speed at which he had cannibalized his own family to save himself was breathtaking. As Richard reached the rope, the furious red flush faded from his face, replaced by a sickeningly smooth corporate smile. His eyes darted to the security guards and then locked onto me. He completely ignored the fact that his daughter was sobbing hysterically less than 10 feet behind him. "Emily, sweetheart." Richard said, his voice practically dripping with artificial warmth. I did not reply. I just stared at him, letting the silence force him to keep talking. "I apologize for that unpleasantness," Richard continued, waving a dismissive hand over his shoulder, as if Rachel were nothing more than a spilled drink on a restaurant floor. "It breaks my heart to see what she has become. But I want you to know something, Emily. Emily, sweetheart. I always knew Rachel was irresponsible. She manipulated us." He took a step closer, gripping the brass post of the velvet rope, as if we were conspirators in a private boardroom. "We were victims of her deceit, just like Jamal was. Richard lied smoothly, his eyes gleaming with naked greed. But you, Emily, you are brilliant. You have always been the smart one. I was tough on you growing up because I knew you had untapped potential. I pushed you because I wanted you to achieve greatness. And look at you now. A $40 million federal endowment. You have built an absolute empire. I raised a single eyebrow, noting how quickly he had rewritten history to make his cruelty sound like supportive parenting. But Emily, you have to listen to me, Richard said, lowering his voice into a persuasive, urgent tone. You are a special education teacher. You have a beautiful heart, but you do not understand the vicious nature of the corporate tech world. Those venture capitalists and government bureaucrats are going to circle you like sharks. They will bury you in compliance fees and bad investments until that 40 million is gone. Let me manage your foundation's portfolio. You need a real businessman. He paused, placing a hand flat against his chest, feigning absolute sincerity. Let me be the shield between your company and the vultures, Richard pleaded, the desperation finally leaking through his polished facade. I have 3 decades of high-level financial management experience. I know the tax loopholes. I know how to aggressively scale capital. We can restructure your board of directors. We can create a family trust to protect your intellectual property. With your brilliant software and my financial ruthlessness, we will double that endowment in 36 months. I looked at the man standing in front of me. This was the exact same man who had laughed in my face 5 years ago when I asked him for a small startup loan. The same man who had called my life work a charity case and a waste of time. Now he was practically begging to be my employee, willing to step over the completely broken body of his favorite child just to get near my bank accounts. You want to restructure my board of directors? I asked, my voice perfectly calm, giving him just enough rope to hang himself. Absolutely. Richard nodded eagerly, his smile widening as he thought he was actually making progress. We clear out the dead weight. We establish absolute control. I will step in as your primary executive consultant. You focus on the charity optics and the software updates. I will handle the money. It will be the perfect partnership, Emily. A father and daughter dominating the industry. We do not need anyone else. We certainly do not need Rachel or your mother draining our resources. Just you and me. I looked past him at Susan, who was listening to her husband actively plot to cut her out of my newly acquired wealth. The look of absolute betrayal on her face was deeply satisfying. The toxic alliance that had terrorized my childhood was finally eating itself alive right on the city sidewalk. Richard was offering to abandon his wife and his favored daughter in exchange for a piece of my empire. He was laying all of his cards on the table, proving once and for all that loyalty meant absolutely nothing to him compared to the allure of extreme wealth. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds. I wanted to see exactly how deep Richard was willing to dig his own grave in front of the flashing cameras. So you are telling me, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, that you are willing to completely cut ties with Rachel, your golden child, the daughter you just spent $80,000 on for a destination wedding while charging me rent to live in a biological hazard zone? Richard nodded vigorously without a single second of hesitation. His eyes were wide with a sickening mixture of greed and desperation. She is dead weight, Emily, he said, his voice dripping with corporate ruthlessness. She lied to me. She forged legal documents. She is going to end up in a federal prison cell. I cannot have that kind of criminal liability attached to my personal brand. I am a respected businessman. I have a legacy to protect. I will legally disown her tomorrow morning if that is what it takes to prove my absolute loyalty to you and your foundation. I looked past his shoulder. Rachel was no longer sobbing into the pavement. She had slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. The heavy layer of shock that had completely paralyzed her was rapidly evaporating. In its place, a raw, explosive anger was taking over. For her entire 35 years of life, Rachel had operated under the absolute certainty that she was our father's favorite. She believed his love for her was unconditional and eternal. She was currently learning the hard way that Richard's love was nothing more than a calculated financial transaction. Rachel staggered to her feet, Her expensive designer dress was smeared with street grime, and her makeup ran in dark black streaks down her cheeks. She looked like a feral animal entirely stripped of her carefully curated country club elegance. "You are going to disown me, Rachel," whispered her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. Richard spun around, clearly startled. He had completely forgotten she was even there, so blinded by his desire to get his hands on my $40 million. "Rachel, you need to go home," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger at her face. "You have done enough damage for one night. Do not ruin this massive business opportunity for me." "Business opportunity?" Rachel shrieked, lunging forward. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive silk suit jacket with both hands, shaking him violently. "I am your daughter. You told me I was your greatest achievement. You told me I was infinitely better than Emily. You told me she was a worthless babysitter and that I was the only one who would ever make you proud." Richard tried to pry her hands off his chest, but Rachel held on with manic adrenaline-fueled strength. "Get your hands off me, you hysterical thief!" Richard yelled, his face turning a bright, dangerous shade of red. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family." "I am an embarrassment," Rachel screamed right in his face, her voice echoing down the entire city block. "What about your offshore accounts, Dad? What about the illegal tax loopholes you constantly bragged about at the country club? You taught me how to forge those documents. You taught me that the only thing that matters is looking rich and crushing anyone who gets in your way. I did exactly what you raised me to do. I am your perfect creation." Susan let out a horrifying gasp. "Rachel, stop it!" Susan cried, rushing forward and frantically trying to pull her daughter away from her husband. "You are airing our dirty laundry in front of the press. People are recording this. You are ruining our reputation." Rachel shoved her mother backward with such massive force that Susan stumbled and nearly fell over the red carpet. "Shut up, Mom!" Rachel hissed, turning her pure venom onto Susan. "You are just as bad. You sat there and let him tear me down because you are terrified he will cut off your platinum credit cards. You do not love me either. You just love the country club memberships and the luxury cars. You are a parasite." The facade was entirely gone. The wealthy, perfect family from the affluent suburbs was currently ripping each other to absolute shreds on a public sidewalk. The press photographers were having a massive field day, their cameras clicking like rapid-fire machine guns, capturing every single second of the total implosion. Richard finally managed to physically shove Rachel away. He aggressively straightened his ruined suit jacket, breathing heavily. "You are completely insane," he spat at her, adjusting his collar. "You are no longer my daughter. I am entirely done with you. Do not ever speak to me again." He turned his back on his weeping family and faced me once again. He plastered that same sickening corporate smile back onto his sweating face, as if the violent physical confrontation behind him had never even happened. Now Emily Richard said, his voice trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. "As you can see, I have completely severed the dead weight. I am entirely focused on our future. When do we start the executive transition? I can be in your downtown office by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I looked at him with absolute clinical detachment. The sheer sociopathy required to pivot from actively destroying your own child to asking for a massive salary in the span of 10 seconds was genuinely staggering. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy suit and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was already illuminated. I held the sleek device up so the bright glow caught Richard's greedy eyes. I tapped the screen exactly once, pausing the secure application that had been running silently in the background. I slowly turned the phone around so Richard could clearly see the digital display. A bright red microphone icon sat at the very center of the screen. Beneath it, a digital timer read exactly 16 minutes and 45 seconds. It was the exact amount of time that had passed since I walked out of the hotel lobby doors. Richard's fake smile faltered. His eyes darted nervously from the glowing screen to my calm face. "What is that?" he asked, his voice suddenly losing all of its false bravado. "That is my ultimate insurance policy, Richard. I said, my voice perfectly level and icy cold. It is a high-definition audio recording of this entire sidewalk conversation. It is currently being automatically uploaded to 3 separate secure cloud servers located across the country. Richard stared at the phone, the terrifying realization of what he had just done crashing down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. "You recorded me," he whispered, the color draining from his face for the 3rd time that night. "I recorded every single syllable," I confirmed, keeping my eyes locked onto his. "I recorded you explicitly throwing your favorite daughter under the bus. I recorded you threatening to legally disown her just to get your hands on my endowment. I recorded Rachel loudly admitting that you personally taught her how to forge financial documents and hide money in illegal offshore accounts. I recorded the absolute permanent destruction of your fake perfect family." "You cannot use that," Richard stammered, taking a terrified step backward. "That is illegal. That is a private conversation between family members." "We are standing on a public sidewalk surrounded by local news reporters," Richard Befresh reminded him, gesturing to the journalists who were eagerly watching our exchange. "There is absolutely no expectation of legal privacy here. But do not worry, I am not going to use it for a press release. I am going to use it as a permanent financial restraining order." I lowered the phone and looked directly into his panicked, sweating face. "You are a desperate, greedy man, Richard. I know exactly how you operate in the corporate world. When Rachel's commercial creditors inevitably come after you for that $2 million defaulted loan, you are going to try to sue me. You are going to go to your expensive lawyers and claim some kind of family obligation. You are going to try to drag my educational foundation into a massive, messy legal battle just to cover your own reckless debts." Richard opened his mouth to deny it, but I cut him off completely. "And if you ever try to contact my company," I continued, my voice dropping into a lethal, unwavering whisper, "if you ever try to file a frivolous lawsuit, or if you ever try to spin a false victim narrative to your country club friends about how your youngest daughter abandoned you, I will email this audio file to every single person you know." I took one step closer, forcing him to look me in the eye. "I will send it to your business partners. I will send it to the federal auditors. I will play it on the evening news. I will let the entire world hear exactly what kind of ruthless monster you truly are. You will be completely unhireable and entirely socially exiled." Richard was completely paralyzed. The breath hitched violently in his throat. He realized in that exact moment that I had just entirely checkmated him. He had willingly handed me the loaded gun, and I was pointing it directly at his precious corporate reputation. He had absolutely zero leverage left. He could not touch my $40 million, and he could not ask me for a single penny of help without instantly destroying his own life. He looked like a completely deflated balloon. The arrogant, wealthy patriarch was gone forever. In his place stood a terrified, broke, aging man who had just traded his entire family for a massive payout he was never, ever going to receive. Richard stood there staring at the digital timer ticking away on my phone screen. The ambient noise of the city, the honking of distant cabs, and the low murmur of the press seemed to rush back into the space between us. He had always been the smartest man in the room in his own mind. Now, he was nothing more than a caged animal caught in a trap he had built entirely with his own arrogance. He slowly lowered his hands, letting them fall limply to his sides. His expensive tailored suit looked suddenly too large for his shrinking, deflated frame. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, securing his financial death warrant. "You actually thought you could just walk up to the velvet rope and demand the keys to my empire," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence. "You spent my entire life telling me I was a terrible investment. You told me I lacked the ruthless edge required to survive in the real corporate world. But you failed to realize that growing up in your house was the ultimate training ground for ruthlessness. I learned how to identify a snake before it even had the chance to bite." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "Emily," he croaked, trying to summon one last pathetic shred of paternal authority. "You cannot do this alone. $40 million is too much for a teacher to manage. You need my financial expertise. Who is going to balance the ledgers? Who is going to protect the capital from the taxes and the venture capitalists? I could not help it. I smiled. It was not a cold, calculated smile. It was a genuinely sweet, radiant smile, born of absolute, undeniable victory. Manage my portfolio, I repeated, letting the words roll easily off my tongue. Richard, my board of directors just officially approved the contract for our new chief financial officer this morning. In fact, you actually met him. Richard's brow furrowed in deep confusion. Met him? He echoed, his voice weak and raspy. Who are you talking about? I do not know any of your tech friends. Right on cue, the heavy brass handles of the VIP reception doors turned. The thick mahogany doors swung open, spilling a wide, brilliant beam of warm golden light across the cold concrete of the red carpet. The muffled sound of a live jazz quartet and the clinking of expensive crystal drifted out into the cool night air, wrapping around us like a blanket of extreme wealth. Jamal stepped back out onto the threshold. He was no longer the stressed, exhausted corporate auditor trapped in a miserable, toxic marriage. He looked entirely reborn. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt, revealing his expensive watch. In his right hand, he casually held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with top-shelf scotch served neat. He took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the amber liquid burn smoothly down his throat before lowering the glass. A relaxed, victorious smile played across his lips. Jamal walked over to where I was standing, taking his place firmly by my side. He looked at Richard and then glanced down at Rachel, who was still sitting on the pavement staring up at him with wide, horrified eyes. "Good evening again," Richard Jamal said, his voice carrying the calm, resonant authority of a man who held every single winning card in the deck. Richard stared at Jamal as if the younger man had just materialized out of thin air. His brain was visibly struggling to process the visual information in front of him. He looked from Jamal to me and then back to Jamal. "What are you doing out here, Jamal?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and sudden rising panic. "Get back here and help your wife." Jamal did not even glance in Rachel's direction. "My wife committed federal wire fraud and permanently destroyed our marriage, Richard." Jamal replied, his tone incredibly smooth and completely unbothered. "My legal counsel will be handling all future communications with her from this moment forward. I am out here because my chief executive officer needed me." Richard's jaw actually dropped. The last bit of color that had just started to return to his face instantly drained away, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. "Your CEO," he repeated dumbly, the words stumbling clumsily out of his mouth. I gestured gracefully toward Jamal. "Richard, I would like to officially introduce you to the brand new chief financial officer of my educational foundation," I said, letting the magnitude of the statement completely crush whatever was left of his massive ego. Jamal has spent the last decade hunting down massive corporate fraud for Fortune 500 companies. He is meticulous, he is brilliant, and most importantly, he possesses an absolutely flawless track record of integrity. He is the only person in this family who has ever had my back, so he is the only person I trust to manage my $40 million endowment. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered backward, grabbing the brass post of the velvet rope to keep himself from collapsing onto the red carpet. "You hired him!" Richard gasped, pointing a shaking manicured finger at his former son-in-law. "I absolutely did," I confirmed proudly. "I offered him a compensation package that doubles what he was making at his previous accounting firm, along with full executive benefits and a permanent seat on the board of directors." Rachel, who had been crying quietly on the ground, suddenly scrambled to her feet. Her face was smeared with dark black mascara, and her expensive designer dress was stained with street dirt. The harsh reality of the situation finally pierced through her thick layer of lifelong denial. Jamal was not just leaving her. He was actively stepping into the massive extreme wealth that she felt entirely entitled to. "You cannot do that," Rachel screamed, her voice ripping through the air with hysterical, raw jealousy. She lunged toward the velvet rope, her hands grasping wildly at the air as if she could physically pull the wealth back toward her. "You cannot steal my husband, Emily. He is mine. That is my money. We are married. He belongs to me." Jamal finally looked directly at Rachel. His eyes were completely devoid of any affection or pity. They were cold, calculating, and entirely indifferent. "You stole my future," Rachel Jamal said, his voice slicing effortlessly through her hysterical screaming. "You stole my retirement, and you stole my trust to buy fake status symbols. Emily simply offered me a professional position that values my hard work and my integrity. You and I are entirely finished. Do not ever contact me again, unless it is through my divorce attorney." Rachel let out a horrifying, agonizing wail. It was the absolute sound of a spoiled child realizing that the entire world had finally stopped catering to her endless tantrums. She collapsed backward into Susan's arms, sobbing so violently her entire body physically shook. Susan just stood there, trembling, completely paralyzed, unable to comprehend how her perfect, affluent family had been utterly and permanently destroyed in less than an hour. Richard was hyperventilating. His chest heaved as he stared at the corporate empire he could never touch and the generational wealth he could never control. The ultimate payoff for me was watching the rapid, frantic calculations run through his greedy mind. He realized that the money he desperately needed to save himself from Rachel's defaulted commercial loans was now being personally guarded by the very man Rachel had just defrauded. Jamal held the only keys to the vault, and Richard knew Jamal would rather watch him burn than hand over a single penny to save his failing real estate investments. Richard had absolutely nothing left to say. His manipulation tactics were entirely useless against undeniable facts and airtight legal boundaries. The toxic patriarch had been completely and permanently neutralized. I looked at the three of them standing on the dirty sidewalk outside the most exclusive party in the city. The family that had mocked me, belittled me, and treated me like a worthless burden was now completely broken and entirely bankrupt. They were standing in the cold, dark street, staring desperately at the warm light of a world they would never be allowed to enter. Jamal raised his crystal tumbler of scotch in a slow mock toast toward Richard. "Better start looking for a highly competent bankruptcy lawyer," Richard Jamal advised, taking another slow sip of the expensive liquor. "I hear the federal courts are incredibly unforgiving this time of year, especially when it comes to co-signed commercial fraud." The look of absolute total defeat on Richard's face was the most deeply satisfying image I had ever seen in my entire life. His shoulders slumped, his arrogant posture completely vanished, and he looked like a broken old man. It was the ultimate payoff for 35 years of emotional abuse. I stood perfectly still for a long moment, letting the absolute reality of the situation settle over the red carpet. The high society elite of the city were beginning to arrive in earnest, stepping out of their black luxury town cars and walking right past the spectacle of my ruined family. Wealthy tech investors and prominent politicians were forced to carefully step around Rachel, who was still sitting on the dirty concrete pavement sobbing into her ruined designer dress. I looked at the three of them, taking in the absolute totality of their destruction. They were a perfect portrait of complete and utter ruin. They were broken, they were completely broke, and they were thoroughly humiliated in front of the exact high society crowd they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. Richard, the proud, arrogant patriarch who had terrorized my childhood with his impossible financial standards, was completely paralyzed. His expensive tailored suit hung awkwardly on his suddenly slumped shoulders. The aggressive corporate posture he had weaponized against me for 35 years had completely evaporated. He was staring blankly at the velvet rope, his mind trapped in a terrifying loop of impending bankruptcy and public disgrace. Susan stood a few feet behind him, clutching her stolen Rolex watch to her chest. She was trembling violently, entirely unable to process the fact that her comfortable country club existence had just been permanently revoked. She looked at the wealthy women walking past her in their elegant evening gowns, women she used to desperately try to emulate, and realized she would never be allowed to sit at their tables again. And Rachel, my supposed perfect sister, the golden child who had built her entire identity on a foundation of lies and stolen money, was completely shattered. She had lost her husband, her fake career, her social status, and her father's conditional love, all in the span of 30 minutes. The cameras continued to flash, capturing her complete narcissistic collapse for the morning news cycle. They had absolutely nothing left. Their entire toxic ecosystem had collapsed in on itself the moment it was exposed to the bright light of the truth. I did not feel sorry for them. I did not feel a sudden surge of familial guilt, or a lingering desire to save them from the consequences of their own actions. I only felt a deep, profound sense of absolute liberation. The heavy, suffocating chains they had wrapped around my self-worth had been completely shattered. I reached down and slowly unclasped the gold latch of my designer clutch. The small, mechanical click sounded incredibly loud in my ears, cutting through the ambient noise of the downtown traffic and the murmuring crowd. I reached my hand inside, feeling the smooth silk lining. I bypassed my platinum credit cards and the heavy metal keys to my new corporate office. My fingers brushed against a small fold of emergency cash I always carried with me. A leftover habit from the days when I was a struggling teacher living in a flooded basement terrified of overdraft fees. I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I held the green paper between my index and middle fingers. I stepped right up to the velvet rope closing the distance between myself and the man who had called me a charity case exactly 3 hours ago. The security guards immediately tensed, prepared to intervene, but I raised my free hand slightly, signaling them to hold their position. Richard slowly raised his head. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of the smug superiority that had always defined his character. He looked at me, and then his gaze slowly dropped to the $20 bill I was holding out toward him. He stared at the money, as if his brain simply could not comprehend what was happening. For his entire life, Richard had used money as a weapon. He used it to control Susan. He used it to manipulate Rachel. He used it to humiliate me. He believed that whoever held the most money held the absolute right to destroy whoever they wanted. Now the daughter he had financially starved and emotionally abused was holding out a single piece of currency, offering it to him like a desperate beggar on a street corner. It was the ultimate emasculation, the final absolute dismantling of his entire ego. "Take it, Richard," I commanded, my voice perfectly level. His hand twitched. For a brief, pathetic second, I actually saw the sheer desperation in his eyes wrestle with his shattered pride. He was a man staring down the barrel of $2 million in defaulted commercial loans. Every single dollar was about to matter to him in a way he had never experienced in his privileged life. His right hand slowly lifted a few inches before freezing in midair, completely paralyzed by the sheer humiliation of the moment. When he refused to take it, I simply opened my fingers. The crisp $20 bill fluttered gracefully through the cool night air. It drifted over the thick velvet rope and landed perfectly at the toe of his expensive Italian leather shoes, resting gently against the dirty concrete. Here I said, my voice carrying a quiet but absolute finality that echoed off the hotel walls. "This is for the Uber pool home." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp as the words struck him. The press photographers leaned over the rope, snapping rapid-fire pictures of the wealthy corporate executive staring down at a $20 bill on the sidewalk. My foundation does not associate with bad investments. I continued, delivering the final, crushing blow to our entire relationship. And I do not associate with toxic people. Have a nice life, Richard. I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another lie, another excuse, or another desperate plea for my wealth. I simply turned my back on him. The physical act of turning around felt like dropping a massive physical weight off my shoulders. I felt lighter, faster, and entirely untouchable. I looked at Jamal, who was standing a few feet away, holding his glass of scotch. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod, acknowledging the absolute masterful precision of the execution. We had both just cut the cancer out of our lives, and we were both walking away completely clean. "Shall we go inside?" Madam Chief Executive Officer Jamal asked, gesturing gracefully toward the VIP entrance with his free hand. "We absolutely shall," I replied, smiling a genuine relaxed smile. "We have a $40 million endowment to manage and a party to attend." We walked together toward the heavy double doors of the hotel lobby. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not care if Rachel was still screaming on the pavement, or if Susan was crying, or if Richard was staring at the money on his shoe. Their reality was no longer my concern. Their problems were entirely their own. As we stepped over the threshold, the warm golden light of the reception washed over us. The sound of the live jazz band swelled, filling the air with a vibrant celebratory energy. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided past, carrying silver trays of expensive appetizers and crystal glasses of champagne. The room was filled with brilliant, passionate people who were actively changing the world. It was a room filled with my peers. We walked deeper into the lobby, leaving the cold, dark street entirely behind us. Behind me, I heard the hotel security guards immediately step forward to secure the perimeter. The two massive men grabbed the heavy brass handles of the exterior doors. They pulled them inward with a smooth, practiced motion. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut. They closed with a deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the marble floor. The heavy metal deadbolt engaged with a loud, definitive click. That single mechanical sound was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute closure. The doors were shut permanently in my parents' faces, locking them out of my success, my wealth, and my future forever. It has been exactly 3 months since the heavy mahogany doors of the downtown hotel clicked shut. I am currently sitting behind a massive, sleek glass desk in my corner office on the 40th floor of our new corporate headquarters. The view from up here is absolutely breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows line the entire perimeter of the room, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the city skyline. The morning sunlight pours in, warming the rich hardwood floors and illuminating the architectural blueprints spread across my desk. It is a very long way from the cold, damp concrete of my parents' flooded basement. I take a sip of my coffee and lean back into my ergonomic leather chair, letting the quiet hum of the active corporate building surround me. There is no yelling here. There is no subtle manipulation or backhanded compliments. The environment I have cultivated is built entirely on mutual respect, transparency, and shared vision. I am looking at a framed photograph sitting near my computer monitor. It is not a picture of my biological parents or my sister. It is a picture taken last week at our foundation launch party. In the photo, I am standing alongside my executive assistant Maria and my entire board of directors. Standing right next to me holding a plaque of recognition is Jamal. This is my chosen family. This is the family that respects me. The heavy glass door to my office swings open, and Jamal walks in holding a digital tablet and a thick stack of financial reports. He is wearing a sharp charcoal suit, but his posture is completely relaxed. He looks 10 years younger than he did on that awful night outside the hotel. The dark, heavy bags under his eyes have completely vanished. The constant tension that used to grip his shoulders is gone. "Good morning, Madam CEO," Jamal says, taking a seat in one of the plush chairs across from my desk. He slides the tablet toward me. "I just finalized the allocation report for the new federal endowment funds. We are officially rolling out our interactive communication software to 300 new public school districts across the country next month. The early data from our beta testing is incredible. We are giving thousands of nonverbal children a voice." I smile, looking over the numbers. The foundation is thriving beyond our wildest expectations. Jamal has been an absolute revelation as our chief financial officer. His meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering integrity have protected our assets and streamlined our expansion. But more importantly, he is finally free. Jamal finalized his divorce from Rachel last week. The judge presiding over the case took one look at the extensive documentation of her wire fraud, her forged signatures, and her rampant embezzlement, and awarded her absolutely nothing. Jamal kept his home, his remaining retirement accounts, and his peace of mind. As for my biological family, the fallout was exactly as brutal and swift as I had predicted. Richard, true to his arrogant and greedy nature, actually tried to sue me. 2 weeks after the gala, his expensive corporate lawyers sent me a massive stack of legal demands. He tried to claim that because I developed a small portion of the early software while renting a room in his house, he was legally entitled to a 20% equity stake in my entire $40 million company. Jamal and my legal team crushed the lawsuit in exactly 48 hours. We submitted the digital copies of my lease agreement, the rent receipts, and the repair invoices proving he acted strictly as a hostile commercial landlord. We also casually mentioned the existence of the high-definition audio recording of his sidewalk betrayal. Richard's lawyers dropped him as a client the very next day, refusing to represent a man with such massive radioactive liabilities. Without access to my wealth, Richard was forced to face the reality of the $2 million defaulted commercial loan he had co-signed for Rachel. The creditors descended on him like starving wolves. His corporate reputation was completely annihilated when the news of the default leaked to his business partners. He was forced out of his executive position and pushed into early retirement. Last month, Richard and Susan officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They had to sell the massive brick colonial house I grew up in just to cover the legal fees and the outstanding bank penalties. Susan lost absolutely everything she valued in life. Without her platinum credit cards and her sprawling estate, her superficial country club friends dropped her immediately. She no longer attends charity luncheons or hosts extravagant holiday parties. She is currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen about how her ungrateful youngest daughter abandoned her. Her stolen vintage Rolex watch was seized by federal authorities to help pay down Rachel's debts. Rachel is facing the darkest reality of them all. The golden child is completely stripped of her gold plating. She is currently awaiting trial for multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. Because Richard refused to pay for her defense, she is being represented by a massively overworked public defender. Her social media accounts, which she used to curate her fake luxurious life, have all been deleted. The last I heard, she was working a minimum wage retail job just to afford her court-mandated restitution payments. She has absolutely no power, no status, and no one left to manipulate. I look away from the financial reports and gaze out the massive window at the city below. I do not feel any anger toward them anymore. The burning resentment that fueled my late nights coding in the dark has completely burned away, leaving only clarity and purpose. They are living the exact lives they earned through their own deceit and cruelty. For 35 years, they tried to write my story for me. They cast me as the background character, the failure, the scapegoat, whose only purpose was to make the golden child look brighter. They told me I was not smart enough or ruthless enough to succeed. I used to think being the failed teacher of the family was my curse. It turned out to be my armor. I did not just build an educational empire, I built a fortress they could never enter. If Richard and Susan had believed in me, they would have tried to control my vision. They would have demanded equity. They would have forced their toxic corporate culture onto my platform, and they would have ultimately destroyed the pure intention behind my work. Their absolute rejection was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. By ignoring me, they gave me the ultimate freedom to build my empire entirely in the dark. By the time they finally noticed my worth, my walls were already too high and my gates were locked tight. I turn back to Jamal, who is quietly reviewing an email on his tablet. He looks up and catches my eye, giving me a warm, supportive smile. "We have a board meeting in 10 minutes, Emily," he reminds me, standing up and adjusting his suit jacket. "Are you ready to go change the world today?" "I am absolutely ready," I reply, standing up and grabbing my notes. I walk out of my corner office, leaving the ghosts of my past far behind me. The narrative is entirely mine now. I am no longer the unwanted daughter begging for scraps of affection at a steakhouse dinner. I am the architect of my own destiny. I have found my true family, and I am doing work that actually matters. Have you ever had to lock your toxic family out of your success? Let me know in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is simply massive, undeniable success. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember to never let anyone else dictate your worth. Keep building your fortress.